All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
So today we're going to be looking at kind of a fundamental tension that I think exists for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and that is the interplay between faith and skepticism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got two really interesting sources that we're going to be looking at today that I think illuminate this tension in some really interesting ways.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig in.
So the first is we've got a quote from Abraham Lincoln,
Right?
and the second is we've got an excerpt from a modern-day sermon.
Interesting pairing.
Yeah, so you wouldn't think that these two sources would have that much in common. But as we'll see, I think that there's actually some really fascinating connections between the ideas that are presented in these two sources.
Yeah, and you know what strikes me right off the bat is that both sources, in a way, are kind of talking about this idea of how easily we can become blind to the value of something or someone when we become too familiar with it. You know, whether it's a person, an idea, a belief system, even like sometimes that familiarity can actually make us more critical, more dismissive.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
that's not, yeah.
interesting, and I think we'll see that play out as we dive into these texts.
Well, let's jump right in with the Lincoln quote. This one really stood out to me. It says, "If I were to try to read, much less answer all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best. I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, what is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference."
Wow.
There's just something so powerful about the conviction in that statement.
Right. And I mean, talk about resilience, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a man who's obviously facing a lot of pressure, a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah, he was present during the Civil War.
Exactly. A time of incredible turmoil and division. And yet you get this sense that he's not letting the noise distract him from what he believes is right.
Right, he's focused on the work, not on the critics.
And, you know, that reminds me of what we were just talking about with familiarity breeding contempt or blindness. It's like he's saying, I can't be swayed by every single opinion, every single attack, because if I did, I'd never get anything done.
Right, and I think there's a real lesson in there for all of us, right?
Hmm.
Like, how often do we get caught up in trying to please everyone or
Yeah.
worrying about what other people think?
Oh, all the time, right?
Yeah.
It's so easy to get bogged down in that.
Yeah, and Lincoln's quote is a good reminder that sometimes you just got to stay focused on your own purpose, on doing what you believe is right, even if it means facing criticism.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting to think about that idea in the context of faith and leadership more broadly,
Yeah.
because, you know, throughout history, you see figures like Christ and Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., even Lincoln himself, who faced intense opposition and criticism.
Right.
But they all had this unwavering belief in their mission,
Mhm.
and that allowed them to persevere and ultimately to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, and that leads us really well, actually, to this sermon excerpt,
Okay.
which focuses on Jesus encountering doubt from people who knew him growing up.
Oh, interesting.
So these are people who knew him as a child, right? They knew his family. They saw him kind of grow up in their community.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, he's performing miracles and teaching with authority.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just like, wait a minute, this doesn't compute.
Right. Like, we know you.
Like, this is the kid who used to, like, play in the streets with us.
Yeah, like, how is this possible?
Right.
I think that speaks to a very human tendency to underestimate what's familiar.
Yeah.
You know, and psychologists actually have a term for this. They call it the mere exposure effect.
The mere exposure effect.
Yeah, and it's basically this idea that repeated exposure to something can actually decrease our liking for it.
Oh, wow.
You know, think about a song that you loved at first, but then you hear it too much on the radio and you start to get sick of it.
Oh, yeah.
It's like you become overexposed to it and it loses its luster.
So true.
And I think the same thing can happen with people with ideas, with even belief systems.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know, we get so used to seeing something a certain way that we stop seeing its value.
Right. We take it for granted.
Exactly.
So how does this mere exposure effect relate to faith then?
Well, I think faith often requires a degree of openness to something beyond our immediate understanding.
Right.
You know, willingness to believe in something that we can't necessarily see or prove.
Mm-hmm.
But when we become too familiar with the rituals, the language, the people associated with a belief system,
Yeah.
we can lose that sense of wonder, that sense of awe.
Right.
And we might start to focus on the flaws, the inconsistencies, the things that bother us rather than the bigger picture.
Right. Right. And the sermon uses this really strong phrase. It says, familiarity has bred contempt.
Yeah, that's a powerful line.
It's kind of harsh, but also kind of relatable, right?
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think we've all had those moments where we've taken something for granted, whether it's a relationship, a job, even the place where we live.
Yeah.
That initial spark, that sense of awe and appreciation can fade over time if we're not careful.
Right, right. So then how do we combat this?
Yeah.
Because it seems like both the Lincoln quote and the sermon excerpt are kind of pointing towards action as a key ingredient.
I think that's a really good observation.
Yeah.
So, Lincoln focused on doing what he believed was right, despite the criticism.
Right.
And the sermon calls for repentance, which in essence is a call to action, right?
Right. A call to change.
Exactly, to align your behavior with your beliefs.
Yeah.
So in both cases, the emphasis is on moving beyond judgment and focusing on self-improvement.
So in a way, both Lincoln and the sermon are challenging us to look inward,
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
to be less concerned with the perceived flaws of others
Right.
and more focused on our own actions and beliefs.
Exactly. And that's where I think that balance between skepticism and open-mindedness comes in.
Okay.
It's healthy to question, to critically examine our beliefs in the world around us. But it's equally important to remain open to new perspectives, to allow ourselves to be surprised, to rediscover the wonder in the familiar.
Yeah, to kind of go back to that childlike sense of awe.
Exactly.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. I really feel like we've uncovered some really interesting connections between these two sources.
Me too.
And it really makes you think about how our own biases and preconceptions can shape our perception of faith and belief.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important takeaway for our listeners to consider, how often are we letting our own familiarity, our own preconceived notions blind us to the value of something or someone?
Right. Or even prevent us from experiencing that sense of wonder and awe
Like so.
that can come with faith.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a perfect segue into a final question that I want to leave our listeners with.
Okay.
And it's this. How can you apply the idea of active faith, this idea of aligning your actions with your beliefs, to an area of your life where you're feeling stuck or skeptical?
That's a good one.
Yeah. So I really want you to think about that.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship that you've taken for granted?
Yeah.
Is there a dream that you've given up on?
Yeah.
Is there a belief that you've become cynical about?
Right.
And how can you start to bridge that gap between your beliefs and your actions?
Yeah. And what would it look like to approach that area of your life with a renewed sense of openness and a willingness to kind of step outside of your comfort zone?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive,
It's been a pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
See you later.